Hello, Assalamu alaikum everybody. We're all safe, sound and healthy. And trust me to always decide to finally do the podcast when I turn on my laptop and decide to just watch a few good dramas to pass the time, seriously. Well, today was another very violent windstorm, which again just ended up in a very non-violent, anticlimactic rain. All that drama, all that chaos, all the thunder cracking and clapping and the lightning and everything. And what did we get? Few drops of rain. Well, that's monsoon for you. But then, it when I was listening to it and all, I suddenly remembered and I was like, hold on. Wasn't the thunder supposed to be the angel's voice? And then I was like, hold on. If it is the angel's voice, then wasn't he supposed to be also, the electrons dancing around, jumping around, creating heat, creating electricity? Isn't that what is supposed to be producing the thunder, the explosion because of the heat and, the massive expansion of heat through the clouds? And, basically, what? So, decided to do a bit of a deep dive. And interesting. Refreshed my memory, went through a whole lot of research, and then decided to share it with you because it is kind of fun. It's fun because remember, in Islam, God keeps on and on telling us, observe, right? Observe, study, research, understand. You will see all the signs and you will see how it all comes back to me. So I was like, okay, this is supposed to be the voice of the angel, right? Which, okay, no joke, very understandable, because if you remember, there are angels in space, as the Holy Prophet himself has said, and that booming sonic sort of a sound that people are managing to hear from space, which they are getting so excited about, is said to be the angels. So, as the Prophet said, that there are, I will probably say it wrongly, but it is something to the effect of that there is no space of a 2 fingers breadth between which you would find an angel. And we do know that angels and jinns are supposed to be extremely huge. And because they live in a different realm, which we will refer to as the spiritual realm, which is also basically the parallel world, because after all, yes, people are now beginning to understand the concept of parallel worlds, where time and space is completely different, but at the same time it is on the same plane, but at the same time it's on a different plane, and voila, it is obviously us and the spiritual world. But anyway, so we have the angels, right? And they're supposed to be these extremely huge people. I'm not going to call them creatures. Okay, so they're these huge people, and so the jinns obviously are just as huge. We're the only miniature version. Yes, thank you very much. Actually, we were not miniatures too. We were the proclaimed giants that people seem to confuse when they talk about the era of the giants, although maybe they're not confused. Maybe there were some other giants, but anyway, we were also originally pretty much gigantic as people. But with each generation, we and the ecosystem around us shrunk. Yes, so that is why the ancient, if you look at some of the surviving ancient ecosystems in the world, you will see that they are huge. They're huge. The trees, the animals, So the animals and the trees from the past were extremely gigantic because the people from the past, the ancient people, were gigantic themselves. So we and the ecosystem, we shrunk. With each passing generation, we're going to shrink a little more from the looks of it. But anyway, why am I sounding so chipper anyway? But anyway, let's go on. So, theology and science. Let's explain wind, rain, thunder, and lightning. Just to sort of as much as I can without becoming too ambiguous, without becoming too long-winded, and, trying to just put it all in quickly. So, as we know that Islam also talks about causality, right? Science explains that, right? So, science explains the whole causality and the the religion or theology, it shows the causality as in how it all begins and what is it behind, the science. Okay, who's behind the science, let's put it this way. So we'll first of all look at the causality of wind, for example. So meteorology explains that wind is supposed to be the movement of air from high pressure to low pressure areas driven by the uneven heating of the earth's surface by the sun, right? So in Islam, this physical movement is directed by specific angelic forces, right? So these angelic forces who are assigned this task, they are known as the divine drivers, in short. Or, well, they're not known as that, but we just call them that to make our lives easier. So the Prophet, peace be upon him, he described the wind as a direct instrument of God's mercy or punishment. Angels are commissioned to move these air masses, controlling their velocity, temperature, and direction. The atmospheric stirrers are also what they are, because the Quran describes winds as impregnating or fertilizing, right? So in Surah Al-Hijr, 15:22, God says, and we have sent the fertilizing winds, right? Now the scientific translation. Spiritually, the angel moves the wind, right? Physically, this manifests as atmospheric pressure gradients that physically transport pollen between plants and drive water vapor upwards to form clouds. Okay, I'm fumbling a bit, okay? I did a lot of research and I'm half blinded by this silly city light that makes me feel blind. But anyway, okay. So basically, the scientific translation is that the manifestation, of atmospheric pressure gradients. So it's basically pressure gradients, okay? As we know, high and low. So these pressure gradients physically transport pollen between plants and drive water vapor upward to form clouds. Okay. Now, 2, the causality of rain. Science explains rain through the water cycle, which we all know. Solar evaporation, condensation into clouds, cloud droplet coalescence or collision, and precipitation when gravity overcomes updrafts, right? Now, Islam details this exact sequence but attributes the operational control to the angel Mikael, which the Christians know as Michael, and his subordinate angels. So it's not him alone, according to Islam. He actually has angels, other subordinate angels working with him to the effect. Now, they we'll refer to them as the cloud herders, okay? So the angels physically drive, gather, and layer the clouds. So Surah Al-Nur 24:43 perfectly outlines the meteorology of a cumulonimbus. I swear I'm going to fumble very badly today. So cumulonimbus, cloud. So as the Quran says, do you not see that Allah drives clouds, that he brings them together, that he makes them into a mass, and you see the rain emerge from within it, right? So the measurement of drops in Islamic tradition, it is held that rain does not fall randomly, okay? Every single drop of rain is distributed according to a precise divine decree, and it is measured and escorted by angels to its exact destination on earth. And that is how we will explain the monsoon, by the way. So, the spiritual physical link. The angel's command alters the local atmospheric conditions. Physically, this causes cooling, which forces water vapor to condense around microscopic dust particles, cloud condensation nuclei, until the drops become heavy enough to fall. Now, the air already exists, basically, okay? So the atmosphere is made up of real physical matter, molecules of nitrogen, oxygen, and water vapor, right? This air is always present surrounding the earth. So the angel creates the movement. So in physics, air only becomes wind when a force causes it to move from one place to another. So science says that this force is a pressure gradient, that is air moving from high to low pressure due to heat. And Islamic tradition confirms that the angels use external instruments created by God for specific tasks. The Hadith, states it very clearly. So I don't think it's a metaphor, okay? I think it actually is an existing tool, because we do know that angels do have their own tools, just like how we, mankind, have our own tools. So in the Hadith, it is mentioned, mihraq. And mihraq is an instrument or a tool of energy or fire, okay? It can be a rod, call it a skewer or a whip or whatever, but it is a specific tool of energy and fire, okay? Or fire. Scholars agree that this is a literal tool created from heavenly matter, okay? And this is what the angel uses to prick the clouds, basically. And and then he commands the clouds. So here's another fun fact. So he's basically like a shepherd, like a shepherd who just goes, herding his sheep. So he has a staff on one hand with which he sort of directs his sheep. And then he also vocally commands his sheep, isn't it? So that is exactly what the angel does, according to, Islamic theology. So in this scenario, the angel is the engineer. So the mihraq is the tool, and the beam of light is the energy transfer, and the resulting melted steel or moving air is the physics reaction. I mean, we're sort of decoding the hadith, okay? So, when the Prophet, peace be upon him, was asked about thunder, he explained it, that it is one of Allah's angels who is in charge of the clouds. He carries in his hand a skewer of fire by which he pricks the clouds to drive them to where Allah has ordered them. So the sound of thunder, when asked about the booming sound, the Prophet, peace be upon him, replied that it is the angel's voice. So that is basically what I'm now saying, right? That the thunder is the angel's voice. Now, you're going to say, if the thunder is the angel's voice, then why do we hear the thunder after the lightning? Because of the speed of light versus the speed of sound. Yes, the thunder that we are listening to is in effect the echo. Yeah, the echo. So he's given his command. The whole process occurs in front of us. We see the electrons dancing and weaving and jumping and, bumping into things. And we see the ice crystals and we don't see, but I mean, we realize that the ice crystals and the hailstones are crashing into each other because of that in the clouds. And, but the command that was given and the clouds that were already pricked, so now we actually then get to listen to that command at the end, because of the effect, the slow speed of sound, the travel of sound, the speed of sound versus the speed of light. That's basically it. So now here's another fun fact. You know what? I realized that I could actually tell what kind of thunder would follow when I looked at the kind of lightning. And this is actually, when I started to do some research into that as to how is it that I can immediately know what kind of thunder is going to follow after a particular kind of lightning. And I found out that actually scientists who have worked on this also, they do recognize this. It's something that even Islam also actually talks about. But again, in Islamic terminology, the Quran differentiates between the general lightning, the barq, and the highly destructive, terrifyingly loud type of lightning bolt called the saika. Or its plural form will be savaik, I think. Yeah. So, what is it exactly? A faraway red flash that always forces a sharp, sky-shattering crash perfectly matches the description of savaik, according to, all my movement and question and answers to and fro. So, because it basically is the targeted execution of power. So, in Surah Al-Ra'd, 13:13, right after mentioning that the thunder praises God, the verse immediately states, and he sends the thunderbolts, Savaik, and strikes with them whom he wills. Right? So, yeah. So, he's praising God. That is, again, one other way of seeing that. So the loudness is a divine decree. Okay, we can see that loudness as a divine decree. So in theology, when the angel uses the instrument, the mihraq, to release a positive giant bolt, the saika, it is a manifestation of God's absolute majesty, right? So the sound doesn't soften over distance because the angel's command carries an unyielding authority meant to shake the earth. So it sounds like the sky is breaking because it is a manifestation of Jalal, which is the divine majesty and power, designed to show humanity that no distance can protect them from the command of God. Yeah. So the red sign of warning. Traditional scholars noted that when signs in the heaven turn red or deep amber, it is often a spiritual sign of warning or an intense manifestation of power. So the fact that the red color is always paired with that undeniable sharp crash is the physical signature of the angel utilizing maximum energy capability of the cloud layout to declare God's perfection. Okay, yes, because basically, again, how would science describe it is that the red flash of thunder that we see is positive energy, so that's positive force, and so it's coming from the top of the clouds, whereas the regular blue bolt of lightning that we see is the negative energy, the negative force, and it comes from the bottom layer of the cloud. And that is why the positive lightning, which is the red lightning, is the most powerful type of electrical discharge on Earth. So scientifically, it is an ultra high energy bolt whose shock wave is strong enough to travel miles clearly. So Islamically, that is the saika, a specific thunderbolt deployed by angelic forces to display the ultimate majesty of the Creator. Now, a massive buildup of wind, thunder, and lightning that results in only a few minutes of lighter rain is what I'm coming to. Remember monsoon season, where you had all the drama, all that chaos, all the thunder crashing, the lightning and everything, and then we just got like a few minutes of rain. And it's like more like a decent rain. I mean, it wasn't like a rainstorm. The storm was all in the skies, not in the rain. So that is a classic monsoon phenomenon, right? Now, both science and Islam explain this as a highly localized, brief brush with the with the mowing storm cell. Okay, so basically, you have a storm cell and it's moving. Okay, yeah, my mouth is not moving the way it should move, so I'm going to mispronounce a lot of words. Because I'm trying to be a bit quick, I don't want to make this into a very long, and boring and tedious sort of a thing. So I guess that's why I'm fumbling a bit too much. But anyway, basically, so you have a moving storm cell, okay? So there are certain areas where basically around you it's raining and it's pouring and it's heavy. But in your own particular area, you're getting light rain. Sometimes that is actually that light rain just being due to all that heaviness and the necessity to just shed a little bit of that water or that moisture from the clouds to disperse the heat, because to cool the area. But sometimes it is also basically literally what we feel it to be, a spatter. Yes, it's raining somewhere else, but the wind has carried that rain and spattered it on your area. Imagine. Dispersed it like pollen. So, in other words, let's call it prefrontal drops, okay? So it is scattering. So when a storm brings immense drama but only a brief lighter shower, you are experiencing one of the two scientific scenarios. Catching the skirt of the storm, the dense core of the heavy downpour is still a few miles away, which is what I just said to you in a very more simpler version, right? And as I said, if you have that 5 to 10 minutes of lighter rain, then that is basically wind-blown droplets being pushed ahead of the main storm cell, so you're getting spattered on. So if the storm is tracking parallel to you, the heavy core will miss your neighborhood entirely, leaving you with just the outer edge, which is the skirt of the rain. So in monsoon climates, basically the air near the ground can be initially very hot and dry. So when the clouds release a massive downpour, a large percentage of the water droplets actually evaporate in the air, because the air is so dry and the heat is so much that the water droplets actually evaporate before hitting the ground, which we've actually physically seen many times happening, isn't it? Especially during this season. So by the time the rain reaches your street, it has dwindled down to a brief lighter shower. So the Islamic explanation now, the precision of the drop, that is why I said I'll come back to monsoon because of that. So if you look at the Islamic theology, according to it, this brief window of rain is viewed as a highly calculated, precise distribution of sustenance risk rather than an incomplete storm. So every drop has a decree, remember? So in Islamic tradition, it is emphasized that rain does not fall in random sheets. It is measured perfectly, and the Prophet, peace be upon him, noted that no year has less rain than another, but God distributes it differently. The few minutes of rain your street received were the exact number of droplets decreed by God for your specific soil, trees, and animals at that exact moment. Now, the shift of the angel's course. If you look at the spiritual framework, the angel driving the clouds, which is Michael or his subordinates, was commanded to pass directly over your area to give it a brief hydration. But the main reservoir of the heavy downpour was designated for the next town or field. So the brief rain is a reminder of God's mercy, which he just gave your area, which is just enough rain to cool the air and settle the dust, while saving the heavy downpour for the land that actually needed it more. So, to summarize it, when a massive storm yields only a few minutes of lighter rain, science says you caught the outer wind-blown edge of a localized monsoon cell, and Islam says you received the exact measured dosage of water that God decreed for your specific patch of earth before the angels moved the cloud to its next destination. So it comes now to the next question, which again, because that confusion does arise. So if the thunder is the angel's voice, then who or what is he commanding? He's using his rod, he's using his mihraq, to prick the clouds. So if he's already pricking the clouds, then what is he commanding? And what's the command and who's he commanding? So he's actually commanding the clouds, as I said earlier. He's commanding the clouds. Now we come to that okay, he's the shepherd and he's herding his sheep, and the sheep are the clouds, and then he's pricking them, and then he's commanding them. So does that mean that the clouds are alive? Well, yes. In Islamic theology, clouds, along with all of nature, possess a form of spiritual consciousness and life. They're not viewed as purely mechanical dead matter. So, as it is in the Quran, in the 17th surah, verse 44, the seven heavens and the earth and whatever is in them exalt him, and there is not a thing except that it exalts Allah by his praise, but you do not understand their exalting. So now, here we come to the next fun thing. Has anybody noticed how a lot of these little details are found with such immaculate retention in fantasy stories of wuxia, the martial arts fantasy world, the wuxia world? Have you ever noticed with what detailed accuracy some of these details are put in? And for example, the fact that every seemingly non-living thing has a spiritual consciousness. The clouds, the swords, the stones, you know. So what is it, And then again, because this is something I've thought about consistently every single time I watch a wuxia series, or I go through a wuxia series or film movie, you know and I really wonder how is it that they managed to retain so many of the details of the spiritual world, which even we, the Muslims, we normal Muslims, we tend to sort of not remember all of this. As I said, we keep forgetting sometimes the basic details, that, oh, so if this was this, then what was that? And we have to go back and check on the books once in a blue moon, right? But why is it that they have such immaculate retention of these very fine details of the spiritual world and of the realm, the two realms and everything, and yet not remember the concept of the divine one? Isn't it? It's a bit weird. And so I started to root through that as well and think that, okay, I'm sure this has the Buddhism influence. So what went wrong here, And then actually I found out that it was actually, despite the fact that it does have Buddhism influence, but it is primarily rooted in the indigenous Taoism and ancient animism, which, by the way, will remind you of Jainism, right? Because Jainism, in Jainism also, they have this thing that, oh, everything is alive, so you shouldn't kill anything, or you shouldn't, eat anything, but even, even in there, they have to put a full stop somewhere, because there's a saying in our language, which I'll just transliterate word for word, that if the horse falls in love with the grass, what shall he eat? Yeah, it's literally that. So, so we have Taoism, we have animism, which purposefully rejects the concept of a single all-powerful monotheistic creator, because in Taoism, it is the way. So basically, Buddhism contributes concepts like karma, reincarnation, right? That's the Buddhism part of it. But Taoism provides the functional framework for martial arts fantasy. And animism, which says that everything has a spirit, which, as I said, is basically Jainism in a way. So they say that everything has a spirit, which is Jing. So just like the Islamic tradition of clouds obeying an angel, Chinese folklore operates on extreme animism. So in Zhenjia lore, non-living matter can develop consciousness. If a cloud, a sword, or a stone absorbs enough qi, over thousands of years, it transforms into a jing, remember, a refined spirit or sprite, which is, through cultivation and everything, right? So the world is viewed as a living organism, right? In the whole wuxia and zhenjia folklore, the martial arts world, right? In that world, the whole world is viewed as a living organism. So when a martial artist communicates with the spirit of the sword or a mountain, they are interacting with the inherent consciousness of that object, mirroring the idea that nature is spiritually alive, right? So where does it then come? How, this where does this thing all come from? I would say that this is basically a very good example of Chinese whispers or the telephone game, because, okay, let's try to understand. Ancient human beings, how did they communicate? Obviously, they did not communicate by writing right from the start. Remember, it was Hazrat Nuh, the Prophet Noah, that was given the pen, right? So before him, again, and even after that, even though he was given the pen, there were so many, there's so many ancient civilizations that we know, and we are seeing remnants or descendants of those civilizations, and we can see that, again, they have retained with such marvelous accuracy the story, for example, of Adam and Eve, right, of Abel and Cain, and they have of everything having a life form, of everything having a spiritual consciousness, of the spiritual realm versus the human realm, or this earthly realm, of the parallel worlds concept. which basically in theology was never a new concept. It was always there, present. Why? Because you have the jinns and you have the angels and all. And so from there again comes the whole, the different stories, the distortion. Because ancient civilizations, how did they pass on stories? They passed it on from mouth to mouth, right? So it's word of mouth. And so what would happen when you would tell the story and you repeat the same story generation after generation from mother to child and child to child is obviously there's going to be a difference. Every single time you tell the story, it's not going to be the exact same, right? So that is what I think. I find you have the Taoist influence and find you have the animism and all, but again they're all branches, right? They're all, if you look at them, they're all branches that are coming up from somewhere, where they're coming from the one single divine message, and that message just got distorted along the line. That's what I would believe. And you know what, history will prove me, because as I said, ancient civilizations, for thousands of years, the crucial cultural and spiritual knowledge was passed down strictly mouth to mouth. And in that process, a single original statement would inevitably be mutated over generations, right? So this is something that anthropologists and historians and theologians will definitely, they would agree to. And in fact, they describe this oral tradition, before the widespread use of writing. So when a story is passed down orally across centuries and continents, three specific things happen that cause it to distort. You have the loss of context, right? So people naturally forget the highly specific details of an old story, which is leveling, and heavily exaggerate the most dramatic parts, which is sharpening. A literal historical event or divine warning gets stripped down to its bare essence, like a terrifyingly narrow bridge. So, for example, and this is where now we'll come to the bridge. If you remember, again, in all Chinese folklore, not just Chinese, in the whole East Asian folklore, the significance of the bridge that you pass through in order to reach your destination, which is where you're going to be questioned by God, ultimately. So that bridge has been described in Islam, it has been described in Christianity, it has been described in Judaism. And in Islam, obviously, that bridge is described by the Prophet, peace be upon him, as the one that is as thin as a hair and as sharp as a blade, right? And notice again with what accuracy they tend to depict that bridge, where sometimes they make the bridge seem long and extremely thin, and sometimes they make it wide and short, which actually is a physical objectification or subjectification of how the Prophet described that how a person would feel while crossing that bridge. So for a person who is burdened with sins, that bridge would be thinner and longer and difficult to cross. And for a person who does not have that burden of sins on him, or at least has a very lesser burden, he would find the bridge wide and shorter and easy to cross. So it's amazing, isn't it? Again, see the details. Just look at the details. So then you have now cultural translation. Okay, that's another way how the stories get lost in the mix, or how they get distorted, right? So if a story traveled from a desert environment to a lush river-dense region like ancient China or Greece, the locals would adapt the imagery to match their surroundings. So a generic trial or barrier after death easily transformed into a concrete local symbol like a roaring river or a bowl of soup. So the next generation could easily visualize it and even identify with it. Okay, and now the third is the loss of the why. So over time, people might remember what the story said. For example, you must cross a razor sharp path, but completely forget the theological framework behind it. So to fill in the blanks, priests and storytellers invented new explanations, like shifting the purpose of the trial from a final judgment day to a test for reincarnation. You see? So that's how the changes then to accommodate to fill in those blanks. That's how they began, embellishments also, changes accordingly. So, for example, the Great Flood. Okay, so this is the ultimate real world example. So, look at the global phenomenon of the flood, which, although at one point we referred to it as the flood myth, but now obviously researchers and archaeologists and historians and people who've gone out there have actually found out proof that no, this wasn't a myth but an actual work of history. So if you look at the Great Flood, look at it. The story retains through every single civilization. But how? Almost every ancient civilization on Earth, separated by massive oceans and thousands of miles, has an oral tradition about a catastrophic world-ending flood, a righteous man, a massive boat, and animals being saved. This story remains regardless, okay, and despite everything. So in Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, it is Prophet Noah, right? Hazrat Nuh, and the Ark. So it's Noah and the Ark. In ancient Mesopotamia, which is ancient Iraq, before Iraq was Iraq, when Iraq was Mesopotamia, it is Utnapishtim, at least, in the Epic of Gilgamesh. In Hinduism, it is Manu building a boat guided by a giant fish. In Native American folklore, various tribes speak of a great deluge where the world was cleansed by water. Very accurate, So, just like my, Chinese whispers idea, the core, undeniable fact survived across the globe, right? So the world flooded, and a chosen few survived on a boat. But the local details, the names of the gods, the shape of the boat, and the reasons for the flood, they got completely mutated based on who was retelling the story around the campfire. Right? Now, hold on, because Islam actually confirms my view as well. As I dig further, I find out that Islam confirms this point of view of mine, okay? Because according to Islam, as we know, God says that the sending of subsequent prophets and final revelation of the Quran was necessary because of this exact reason. See, so in Islam, as we know, previous scriptures and oral teachings were continuously subjected to this Chinese whisper distortion, right? This is actually said in Islam. This is said by God himself as well, when he says that I brought 124,000 something prophets in this world, all over the world, through time, and there is not a single nation that hasn't had a prophet, right? And why was it necessary? According to God himself, it was necessary to send prophets time and again in order to revive the message, because the message kept getting distorted along the way, right? Because every single time a detail here or a detail there got misremembered, the original divine messages got distorted over time. A final unchangeable written anchor was required to stop this Chinese whisper permanently and restore the original undistorted truth, right? So it's just like how basically the concept of angels, as this is something that I think is very clear to those of us who are very clear on the concept of angels and jinns, is that the concept of angels transformed into regional gods, right? Or nature spirits in pagan mythologies, or deities even, those immortals, the deities, whatever, they're probably all that, right? Because the way they describe them and their work is very, very, very close. Again, see, it's frightening how they remember the exact details of how the angels work and what tools they use. They remember the angel that writes the fate of people in the world. They remember the angel who guards the book, sorry. They remember the angel in the wuxia and in the zhanjia folklore in the martial arts world. They literally remember every single angel and every single task of every single angel to perfection. The one who guards the book of faith, the one who's assigned for, rain and water, the one who's assigned for, death, the one who's assigned for, I mean, they remember everything, but they give them the identification of deities or of immortals who have cultivated themselves from human beings into those immortal deities, right? Now, they basically transformed them into regional gods, in other words. Okay, look at the Hindus, look at the Japanese, look at the Chinese, look at even the Aborigines, or look at the other, the ancient indigenous cultures around the world. Now, so you're seeing this transition from strictly oral cultures to written records, and how it locks stories in place, right? So, similarly, the concept of, jinx comes from jinns. Yes, believe it or not, it's fun. It's another fun fact. So we know that jinns exist, and they're made of smokeless fire, right? So they're made of smokeless fire. The angels are made of light. Now, again, look at the mythology all over. Look at just the mythology and just the martial world alone, and you will see that again. You see on one side the demons who are always glowing and with fire and in fire and all of that, and then you see the immortals who are with light, and they're so yeah, again, they're basically again remembering a distorted version of the original stories of how the angels and the jinns had a combat, which even in Christianity they bring that. But again, even in Christian related lore, they tend to mix again lore with original story. So that's again another problem. Similarly, if you look at the Hindu mythology on Ram and Ravan, hello, that is a classic example of Abel and Cain, Habil and Kabil, the sons of the first human beings on earth, Adam and Eve. It's basically the same story all over again. So what the Hindus again did is that they misremembered the OG story, and so as it went through time, it got distorted to this extent, where the ancient human beings became again their regional gods, when they were actually the first humans on earth, who are basically our ancestors, right? So this is how I've constantly noticed this throughout, everything whenever I pick up stories, or whenever I pick up myths or alleged myths, So that is why also I do believe, and as I've said this many times in some of my previous podcasts, is that I believe that there is not a single thing that comes out of our imagination that doesn't exist. If it is coming out of our brains, if it is coming out of our imagination, it exists in some form, or it existed in some form. For example, dragons. Remember the fire-spitting lizards? Yeah. We still have those fire-spitting lizards, by the way. And remember, as I said, ancient animals were huge because people were huge. The whole ecosystem was huge. We've all shrunk. The animals have shrunk. Look at the mammoths. Look at the elephants. Look at the rhinos and the hippos. We refer to them as the remnants of the dinosaur times, right? Because they are literally of that. They are from those times. They shrunk with time. They changed. They evolved or devolved as the ecosystem evolved and devolved, as human beings also evolved and devolved. So it's kind of fun when you look at all of that. But I'm telling you, I am always amazed at the finest details that the wuxia world manages to remember and retain. Although, yeah, they do say that, yes, it does come from Buddhism, it comes from Taoism, and it does come from Islamic theology as well. They do say that yes, these three are the major factors behind the wuxia world. I get that. But those details, I'm telling you, again, it just makes me think, how can they remember all those details and yet forget the divinity? itself. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. So I've noticed that so many details have been very meticulously retained by ancient civilizations and cultures, indigenous cultures, you know, and yet the actual main message. I mean, the main message with that the whole thing returns to one being, one God. That got lost in the conundrum. It's a bit weird, don't you think? Well, this is me signing out. Khuda Hafiz.